Susan Wheeler was alive when they buried her in Cincinnati, Ohio. The proof was in her smartwatch, which continued tracking her heartbeat for 27 hours after she vanished from a PriceRite parking lot on October 3, 2005. Security cameras captured the 38-year-old school administrator walking to her car at 5:13 p.m., phone pressed to her ear as she spoke with her husband, promising to pick up their son from basketball practice. A dark blue sedan pulled alongside her Toyota, and Susan's smile faltered slightly before the camera feed cut to another angle. It was the last time anyone would see Susan Wheeler alive, until a determined detective reopened her case 8 years later. Cincinnati in 2005 embodied the essence of Midwestern charm with its distinctive blend of urban development and close-knit neighborhoods. The city of 330,000 residents prided itself on its strong community bonds, with neighborhood festivals, Friday night high school football games, and church potlucks forming the social backbone of daily life. Here, people knew their neighbors' names and kept porch lights on to guide each other home. In the northern suburb of Fairfield, the Wheelers had built their life in a modest 2-story home with blue shutters and a maple tree that blazed with autumn colors each October. Susan Wheeler was the family compass, organized, thoughtful, and dedicated to her work as an administrator at Fairfield Central High School. At 38, she balanced career demands with raising 2 children, 14-year-old Jason and 11-year-old Lily, while maintaining the stable, loving home her husband Mark depended on. Friends described her as the glue holding everything together, always the first to volunteer for school fundraisers and the last to leave neighborhood gatherings. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. October 3, 2005 began like any ordinary Monday. Susan left for work at 7:30 a.m., kissing her children goodbye at the door, reminding Jason about basketball practice and promising Lily they'd bake cookies that evening. The autumn morning was crisp, with golden sunlight filtering through trees whose leaves had just begun to turn. At work, Susan attended meetings, answered emails, and coordinated the upcoming fall festival, all routine tasks performed with her characteristic efficiency. At 4:45 p.m., Susan texted Mark that she'd stop by PriceRite for groceries before picking up Jason from practice at 6 o'clock. Security footage showed her entering the store in a rust-colored cardigan and black slacks, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She moved with purpose through the aisles, selecting pasta, ground beef, and fresh vegetables for that night's dinner. At checkout, she chatted briefly with the cashier about the unseasonably warm weather. At 5:13 p.m., cameras captured Susan pushing her cart across the parking lot while talking on her phone. Mark would later confirm they were discussing Jason's upcoming history project. The conversation was ordinary. She laughed at something Mark said, mentioned picking up their son, and promised to be home by 6:30 to start dinner. As she approached her white Toyota Camry, a dark blue sedan slowly pulled alongside her. Susan's expression changed subtly, not fear, but recognition. She nodded to someone in the vehicle. Then she moved out of the camera's range. When 6 p.m. arrived and Susan failed to appear at basketball practice, Jason called his father. Mark, initially unconcerned, assumed his wife was running late. By 6:30, with both Mark and Jason waiting outside the gym, mild annoyance turned to unease. By 7:15, with Susan not answering calls or texts, worry became fear. Mark drove Jason home, checking their neighborhood streets, hoping to see Susan's white Camry turning the corner. At home, Lily waited by the window, periodically running to the door whenever she heard a car approach. "When's Mom coming?" she asked repeatedly, her voice growing smaller each time. Mark called Susan's colleagues and friends, but no one had seen her since she left work. The pasta ingredients Susan planned to use for dinner sat untouched on the counter, a silent reminder of plans never fulfilled. As 9 p.m. approached with no word from Susan, Mark could wait no longer. His hands trembled as he dialed 911. "My wife is missing," he told the dispatcher, his voice breaking. "She never picked up our son from practice. She always calls if she's running late. Something's wrong." Within 30 minutes, 2 Fairfield police officers arrived at the Wheeler home. They sat in the living room, notebooks open, asking questions that seemed simultaneously too specific and too vague. What was Susan wearing? Did she have any enemies? Had there been marital problems? Financial issues? Mark answered steadily, though his voice occasionally faltered. Jason and Lily huddled together on the stairs, listening, their faces pale with fear. Susan would never just disappear, Mark insisted, showing officers her final text about stopping at PriceRite. She's the most reliable person I know. She wouldn't leave our son stranded at practice. Officer Ramirez, the younger of the two, nodded sympathetically while his partner typed notes into a tablet. We'll put out an alert for her vehicle and check the store's security footage, he promised. But Mark caught the skeptical glance between the officers, the unspoken suggestion that Susan might have left voluntarily, and felt a surge of anger. My wife didn't run away, he said firmly, struggling to keep his voice even for the children's sake. Something happened to her. Outside, blue and red lights illuminated the maple tree in pulses. Neighbors emerged from their homes, first watching from porches, then approaching with concerned questions. Soon the Wheeler driveway filled with people bringing coffee, blankets, and offers to search nearby streets. Karen Davis from next door hugged Lily close, whispering reassurances the woman couldn't possibly guarantee. Robert Chen, who coached Jason's basketball team, organized a group of parents to drive through the surrounding neighborhoods, scanning for Susan's white Toyota. The Wheelers' phone rang constantly, Susan's sister from Columbus, her parents in Indianapolis, colleagues and friends all asking variations of the same question, have you found her? Mark repeated the same painful answer, no, nothing yet. As midnight approached, police returned with troubling news. Security footage from PriceRite showed Susan in the parking lot, then a dark blue sedan approaching her. But after that, nothing. Susan never returned to her car. The store manager reported finding an abandoned cart containing groceries, which matched Susan's purchases according to her receipt. Most disturbing was the discovery of Susan's purse, still containing her wallet and ID, on the ground beside a cart corral. What about her car? Mark asked, gripping the edge of the sofa. It wasn't in the parking lot, Officer Ramirez replied. We've put out an alert for it. This revelation transformed the atmosphere in the Wheeler home. What had been anxious waiting became crushing dread. Susan's purse abandoned but her car missing suggested something far more sinister than a woman who decided to leave. Mark sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands while Lily sobbed against Karen's shoulder. Jason stood rigid by the window, staring out into the darkness as if willing his mother to appear. At 2 a.m., police departed after taking statements and collecting recent photos of Susan. They promised to escalate the case and begin an official investigation at daybreak. As the front door closed behind them, Mark felt the weight of helplessness crash over him. For years, Susan had been his partner in navigating life's challenges, raising children, managing finances, weathering family crises. Now, with her vanished, their home felt like a ship without its captain. The night stretched endlessly. Mark made calls to Susan's parents and sister, each conversation more painful than the last. Neighbors eventually departed, promising to return in the morning to help search. Karen stayed, sleeping on the couch to help with the children, who finally collapsed into exhausted slumber around 3 a.m. Mark paced the hallway, checking his phone obsessively, jumping at every sound. As dawn broke on October 4th, Fairfield awoke to news that sent ripples through the community. Susan Wheeler, beloved school administrator and mother of two, had vanished without a trace. Morning news broadcasts showed Susan's smiling photo alongside the headline, "Local woman missing after trip to grocery store." The story spread rapidly, and by breakfast time, it dominated conversations in diners, offices, and school hallways throughout Cincinnati. For the Wheeler family, the new day brought no relief, only the harsh reality that Susan's absence was not a nightmare they could wake from. Mark moved through the morning in a fog, helping Lily dress for school while Jason insisted on staying home to help search. Both children picked at their breakfast, untouched cereal bowls a testament to appetites suppressed by fear. At 8 a.m., Fairfield police expanded their investigation. Detective Samuel Harrison, a veteran officer with 15 years in missing persons cases, arrived at the Wheeler home. With salt and pepper hair and a weathered face that revealed years of difficult cases, Harrison brought both experience and compassion to the investigation. "We're treating this as a potential abduction," he told Mark directly, his voice low enough that the children couldn't hear from the kitchen. "The abandoned purse, the missing car, these aren't typical signs of someone leaving voluntarily." Mark nodded numbly. "I've been telling them that since last night." Harrison spread a city map across the dining table, marking Susan's workplace, PriceRite, and the routes she typically drove. "We need to establish a timeline and search pattern," he explained as additional officers arrived. Outside, volunteers from the community gathered, teachers from Susan's school, parents of her students, church members, and neighbors. Many carried photos of Susan, ready to canvass the area. The search began methodically. Teams spread out across Fairfield, focusing first on the areas between PriceRite and the high school where Jason's practice had been held. Officers knocked on doors, asking if anyone had seen Susan or her white Toyota Camry. Volunteers distributed flyers with Susan's photo and the bold word "missing" at gas stations, restaurants, and stores throughout the area. By midday, police made their first significant discovery. A jogger reported seeing a white Toyota parked at Heritage Park, about 3 miles from PriceRite. Officers rushed to the location, and Mark's heart plummeted when they confirmed it was Susan's Camry. The car sat abandoned in a remote corner of the parking lot, keys still in the ignition, driver's door slightly ajar as if Susan had left in a hurry. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As forensic technicians processed the scene, Detective Harrison pulled Mark aside. "There's something else," he said quietly. "Susan was wearing a smartwatch, correct?" Mark nodded. "She tracks her steps for exercise." Harrison's expression tightened. "Our tech team accessed her fitness account. The watch is still active and transmitting data." For a moment, hope surged through Mark. "She's alive? You can track her?" "The watch is still recording heart rate," Harrison confirmed, his tone careful. "But we can't pinpoint its location beyond a general area northwest of the city. The signal is weak and intermittent." This revelation electrified the investigation. A command center was established at Fairfield Central High School, where large maps tracked search zones and teams coordinated efforts. Officers used Susan's smartwatch data to narrow their focus to an area near the Great Miami River, approximately 15 miles northwest of where her car was found. News of the active smartwatch spread quickly. Local television stations interrupted regular broadcasting with updates. "Missing woman smartwatch still active" flashed across screens throughout Cincinnati. Helicopters circled the search area while drone teams deployed to scan dense wooded regions near the river. At the Wheeler home, Mark watched the news coverage with a terrible mixture of hope and dread. The knowledge that Susan's heart still beat somewhere in the darkness was both comfort and torture. Was she injured? Confined? Able to call for help? The questions burned through his mind as he held Lily close, trying to shield her from the most frightening possibilities. By evening, the search area swarmed with professionals and volunteers. Police set up floodlights along the riverbank, illuminating the water's edge as dive teams prepared to search at first light. K-9 units tracked through underbrush, but the October rain that began falling at sunset complicated their efforts, washing away scents and turning paths to mud. Detective Harrison returned to the Wheeler home late that night, his expression grave. He pulled Mark into the kitchen, away from the children who had finally fallen asleep. "The smartwatch stopped transmitting at 8:17 p.m., he said quietly. "No further heart rate data is coming through." Mark gripped the counter, legs suddenly unsteady. "What does that mean?" Harrison chose his words carefully. "It could be several things. The battery might have died. The watch could be damaged. Or..." He left the final possibility unspoken, but it hung in the air between them. For 27 hours after Susan's disappearance, her smartwatch had recorded her heartbeat, proof of life that kept hope alive. Now that tenuous connection had vanished, leaving only questions and deepening fear. That night, as rain lashed against the windows of the Wheeler home, Cincinnati faced an unsettling truth. A woman had vanished from a busy parking lot in broad daylight, leaving behind only digital echoes of her existence. For the Wheelers, the loss of the smartwatch signal marked a new phase of their nightmare, one where hope began to fade into grim reality. The following morning brought a development that turned the investigation in an unexpected direction. Police examining security footage from businesses near Heritage Park discovered a grainy image of a man parking Susan's Toyota at 5:47 p.m. on October 3, just 34 minutes after she disappeared from PriceRite. The figure, wearing a baseball cap pulled low, exited the vehicle and walked quickly toward a dark sedan waiting nearby. Though the image quality was poor, detectives noted the man's distinctive limp. Detective Harrison shared the footage with Mark, who stared intently at the screen. "I don't recognize him," Mark said, frustration evident in his voice. "The cap hides his face, and the image is too blurry." Harrison nodded. "We're enhancing it now, but this confirms Susan didn't drive her car to the park. Someone else did." This evidence reinforced what the Wheeler family had insisted from the beginning: Susan hadn't left voluntarily. She had been taken. The revelation sent shockwaves through Fairfield, transforming community concern into outright fear. Parents began escorting children to bus stops. Women shopped in pairs. Security guards appeared in parking lots across the city. The investigation intensified as police compiled a timeline. Susan left PriceRite at 5:13 p.m. A dark sedan approached her. By 5:47 p.m., an unknown man parked her car at Heritage Park. Meanwhile, Susan's smartwatch continued recording her heartbeat until 8:17 p.m. the following evening, somewhere near the Great Miami River. 5 days into the search, with rain still hampering efforts, police expanded their investigation, interviewing dozens of people connected to Susan, colleagues, friends, even parents of students she had helped. They reviewed her email and phone records, seeking any clue to explain her disappearance. Nothing unusual emerged. Susan Wheeler had been exactly what she appeared: a devoted mother, dedicated administrator, and beloved community member with no secret life, no hidden conflicts. Meanwhile, the media transformed Susan's disappearance into a sensation that reached far beyond Cincinnati. National news programs featured her story, experts speculated on crime panels, and social media filled with theories ranging from plausible to outrageous. Some suggested domestic troubles the family kept hidden. Others claimed Susan had orchestrated her own disappearance. The wildest theories involved organized crime or serial predators. For the Wheeler family, these rumors were salt in an open wound. Mark found himself not only searching for his wife but also defending her memory against increasingly bizarre speculation. "Susan was taken from us," he told reporters firmly after one particularly hurtful newscast. "She didn't run away. She didn't have secrets. Someone took her from that parking lot while she was on the phone with me." As October days shortened and temperatures dropped, the initial surge of volunteers dwindled. The command center at Fairfield Central High School gradually emptied as the urgent crisis evolved into a persistent mystery. Daily updates became weekly briefings. Susan Wheeler's disappearance settled into Cincinnati's consciousness not as breaking news, but as an unsolved enigma. For Mark, Jason, and Lily, life acquired a terrible new rhythm. Mornings began with hope that faded by nightfall. They attended school and work because routine provided the only stability left in their shattered world. Mark took leave from his accounting job to care for the children, whose grief manifested differently. Jason withdrew into angry silence, while Lily clung to the belief her mother would walk through the door any day. On October 23, 20 days after Susan vanished, the investigation reached a devastating milestone. During a search of an abandoned warehouse near where the smartwatch's final signal originated, police dogs alerted to an area of disturbed earth in the basement. Excavation revealed Susan's smartwatch, broken, dirt-covered, but unmistakable, buried approximately 3 feet underground. The discovery confirmed the worst fears of investigators and family alike. The device had continued recording Susan's vital signs while buried with her, transmitting data until its battery failed or the burial depth blocked its signal. Forensic teams converted the warehouse into a meticulous crime scene, working day and night to recover evidence. 3 days later, they found Susan's remains buried in the same basement, approximately 20 feet from where the watch was discovered. The cause of death was determined to be asphyxiation. Despite the devastating discovery, one mystery deepened. Susan had been buried twice, first with her watch, then moved and reburied without it. This suggested a killer who realized the watch might be trackable and returned to separate it from her body. The news broke Cincinnati's heart. Hundreds gathered outside the Wheeler home with candles, forming a silent circle of light in the darkness. At Fairfield Central High, students created a memorial of flowers and photos. The city mourned not just a woman but the shattering of its sense of safety and community trust. For the Wheeler family, grief crashed in waves that threatened to drown them entirely. Mark struggled to answer Lily's impossible questions. Why did someone hurt Mommy? When will she come back from heaven? Jason's silence hardened into a shell that even his closest friends couldn't penetrate. The once vibrant family home became a museum of pain, where Susan's absence was a presence in itself. The case might have faded into Cincinnati's tragic history, joining other unsolved crimes that haunt communities for generations. But Detective Harrison refused to let Susan Wheeler's file grow cold. Even as other investigations demanded attention, he returned to the evidence, the security footage, the smartwatch data, the forensic reports from the warehouse. Something nagged at him, a pattern just beyond his grasp. 2 months after Susan's body was discovered, Harrison made a connection that would ultimately break the case wide open. The abandoned warehouse where Susan was found had once belonged to Meridian Construction, a company that had renovated Fairfield Central High School the previous year. Cross-referencing employee records with the security footage, Harrison identified a potential match for the limping figure who parked Susan's car, Victor Mercer, a 42-year-old contractor who had worked extensively at the school during renovations. Further investigation revealed Mercer had been fired from Meridian 6 months before Susan's disappearance, following complaints about inappropriate comments toward female staff members at the school. The timing suggested motive, a grudge against the institution where Susan worked, while his knowledge of the warehouse provided opportunity. When police searched Mercer's apartment, they discovered a dark blue sedan matching the vehicle in the PriceRite footage, recently repainted gray. More damning was a school ID badge belonging to Susan, hidden in a desk drawer, kept as a trophy. Hair fibers in the trunk matched Susan's DNA. Victor Mercer was arrested on December 17, 2005. Though he initially maintained his innocence, the evidence mounted inexorably against him. Prosecutors theorized that Mercer had observed Susan's routines during his time working at the school, planned the abduction carefully, and approached her in the parking lot posing as someone needing directions. Once she was in his control, he drove her to the warehouse, a location he knew was isolated and abandoned. The case against Mercer strengthened when cell tower data placed his phone near both PriceRite and Heritage Park at the critical times. The final piece fell into place when investigators discovered Mercer had searched online for information about fitness trackers and GPS tracking just hours after Susan's abduction, explaining why he returned to separate the watch from her body. For Cincinnati, the arrest brought complex emotions. Relief mixed with horror that the killer had been among them, watching and planning. The community that had once felt secure now questioned who else might harbor hidden malevolence behind ordinary facades. As 2005 drew to a close, the Wheeler family faced their first holiday season without Susan. The pain was raw, but the knowledge that her killer would face justice provided a fragile foundation for healing. Mark established a scholarship in Susan's name at Fairfield Central, ensuring her legacy of supporting education would continue. Though their lives would never return to what they had been, the Wheelers began the long journey toward finding a new normal in a world irrevocably changed. January 2006 dawned gray and bitter over Cincinnati. The arrest of Victor Mercer had temporarily satisfied the public's demand for justice, but as winter deepened, the legal process revealed its true nature, a slow, methodical grind that offered little comfort to the grieving. For the Wheeler family, each court appearance reopened wounds barely begun to heal. Mark would sit rigid in the courtroom, eyes fixed on the man who had destroyed their lives, while Mercer's attorney filed motion after motion to delay proceedings. "The prosecution needs more time to process forensic evidence," explained Assistant District Attorney Elena Morales during a particularly frustrating postponement. "We want to ensure this case is airtight. The last thing anyone wants is for a technical error to allow an appeal." Mark understood the logic but struggled with the emotional toll. "Every delay feels like Susan is being forgotten all over again," he confided to Detective Harrison after a February hearing. "My kids keep asking when the bad man will go to jail forever. I don't know what to tell them anymore." Harrison, who had become a fixture in the Wheeler home during the investigation, placed a weathered hand on Mark's shoulder. "Justice moves slower than grief," he said quietly. "But I promise you, it does move." As spring tentatively returned to Cincinnati, bringing pale green buds to the maple tree in the Wheelers' yard, the case against Victor Mercer solidified. Forensic technicians recovered microscopic blood traces from his sedan despite his attempts to clean it. Cell tower records confirmed his movements on October 3 aligned precisely with Susan's disappearance timeline. Most damning was the search history on his computer, revealing methodical research on police procedures, body decomposition, and tracking device limitations. In April 2006, 6 months after Susan's body was discovered, Mercer's attorney approached the prosecution with an unexpected offer. His client would plead guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for revealing the full details of the crime. The prospect of avoiding a lengthy trial appealed to prosecutors, but they first brought the proposal to Mark. "I need to know everything," Mark said firmly when Morales presented the option. "Not just for closure, but so my children will someday understand what happened to their mother. No more secrets, no more speculation." On a rain-soaked morning in late April, Victor Mercer sat across from prosecutors and Detective Harrison in a sparse conference room at the Hamilton County Courthouse. His confession, recorded and transcribed over 6 hours, revealed a crime more calculated than investigators had initially understood. Mercer had become fixated on Susan during the school renovations in 2004, when she regularly checked on the construction progress. Her polite refusals of his lunch invitations festered into resentment, particularly after she reported his inappropriate comments to Meridian Construction. His termination 6 months later catalyzed his obsession into something darker. "I watched her for weeks," Mercer admitted, his voice flat and emotionless. "I learned her schedule, where she shopped, when she was alone. The day it happened, I saw her at PriceRite and knew it was time." The confession confirmed what the evidence had suggested. Mercer approached Susan in the parking lot, claiming car trouble. When she leaned in to look at his engine, he forced her into his vehicle. He drove her directly to the abandoned warehouse, a location he knew well from his construction days. There, in the cavernous basement where Meridian once stored equipment, Susan Wheeler spent her final hours. What the confession added was the chilling detail about the smartwatch. Mercer hadn't initially realized its significance until he saw news reports about police tracking the device. He returned to the warehouse the following evening, disinterred Susan's body, removed the watch, and reburied her in a different location within the same basement, a calculated attempt to misdirect investigators that ultimately failed when cadaver dogs found both burial sites. When Harrison delivered this information to Mark, the details struck like physical blows. Mark had imagined countless scenarios during the months of uncertainty, but the reality, cold, premeditated, stemming from rejection, somehow seemed both more mundane and more horrifying than anything he had envisioned. "He killed her because she wouldn't have lunch with him?" Mark asked incredulously, hands trembling around a mug of untouched coffee. "That's it?" Harrison nodded grimly. "Most killers aren't masterminds or monsters from movies. They're ordinary people with dangerous flaws, fragile egos, poor impulse control, distorted thinking. In Mercer's mind, your wife's rejection justified everything that followed." Mark struggled to process this. How could he explain to Jason and Lily that their mother died because a man couldn't handle being told no? What lesson could possibly be extracted from such senseless violence? In May 2006, Victor Mercer stood before a judge and pleaded guilty to murder in the second degree. The plea deal spared the Wheeler family the trauma of a trial but guaranteed Mercer would serve at least 25 years before any possibility of parole. As the judge delivered the sentence, Mark sat surrounded by family and friends, Susan's parents clutching his hands, his children leaning against him for support. When asked if he wished to address the court, Mark approached the podium slowly. He unfolded a sheet of paper, then set it aside, choosing instead to speak directly to Mercer. "You didn't just take Susan's life," he said, voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "You took Jason's mother helping him with homework. You took Lily's mother braiding her hair before school. You took my wife's laugh on Sunday mornings and her hand in mine on evening walks. You stole thousands of moments we'll never get back." He paused, gathering himself. "But here's what you didn't take, our love for her. Our memories. The impact she had on this community. Those things live on, and they're beyond your reach forever." The courtroom fell silent as Mark returned to his seat. Even Mercer, who had remained impassive throughout the proceedings, looked momentarily shaken. With the bang of a gavel, the legal chapter of Susan Wheeler's story came to a close. Justice had been served in the eyes of the law, but for her family, the journey was far from over. As summer settled over Cincinnati, the Wheeler family confronted a new reality. The intense focus of the investigation and trial had provided a kind of terrible purpose. Now, with Mercer sentenced and media attention fading, they faced the quieter challenge of rebuilding their lives in Susan's absence. Mark returned to work, finding both distraction and purpose in the familiar routines of his accounting firm. The children approached their grief differently. Jason channeled his anger into basketball, playing with an intensity that both worried and impressed his coaches, while Lily filled notebooks with letters to her mother, each one beginning "Dear Mom in Heaven" and detailing the events of her day. The house on Maple Street gradually transformed. Susan's clothes remained in the closet for months until Mark finally donated them to a women's shelter. Her garden, once meticulously tended, grew wild until Jason unexpectedly took an interest, spending weekend afternoons pulling weeds and planting the vegetables his mother had loved. Small rituals emerged, Sunday dinners where they shared memories of Susan, a birthday cake made from her recipe each October. While the Wheelers worked to heal, the community's attention inevitably shifted to new concerns. The media moved on to fresher tragedies, and neighbors who had once brought daily casseroles now visited only occasionally. Even Susan's memorial scholarship at Fairfield Central received fewer donations as the months passed. This natural fading of public memory stung Mark deeply, as if Susan was being forgotten a second time. "It's like the world expects us to be over it," he confided to Susan's sister during a rare weekend visit. "Like there's a timeline for grief, and we've exceeded our allotment." "People move on because they can," she replied gently. "They didn't lose what you lost. But remember how many lives Susan touched. She's not forgotten, just carried differently by different people." This perspective helped, but the loneliness remained. Mark found himself adrift in unexpected moments, parent-teacher conferences where he sat alone, taking notes Susan would have organized, holiday gatherings where her absence felt like a physical space no one could fill, late nights when a house emptied of children's voices became unbearably quiet. Detective Samuel Harrison remained one constant connection to that terrible October. Unlike others who drifted away, Harrison checked in regularly, sometimes bringing coffee and sitting silently with Mark on the porch, other times helping Jason with home repair projects. The detective had seen too many families shattered by violence to pretend that closure was anything but a comforting myth. "People talk about moving on like grief is a train station you leave behind," Harrison said during one such visit, nearly a year after Susan's death. "It's more like learning to carry something heavy. Some days it gets easier to bear, other days it crushes you all over again. Both are normal." By October 2007, as the second anniversary of Susan's disappearance approached, the Wheeler family had established a new rhythm to their lives. Not healing, exactly, but adaptation, learning to navigate a world permanently altered. Mark had joined a support group for widowed parents, finding unexpected comfort in sharing experiences with others who understood his particular pain. The children showed signs of resilience amid their continuing grief. Jason's grades had stabilized after a difficult year, and Lily had begun to laugh again, a sound that both healed and hurt Mark's heart. On the anniversary itself, they held a small ceremony at Susan's grave, bringing yellow daisies, her favorite, and spending an hour sharing memories both painful and sweet. Afterward, rather than retreating into separate grief as they had the previous year, the family went to Susan's favorite restaurant and ordered her preferred meal, finding comfort in continuing traditions she had established. That night, as Mark tucked Lily into bed, she asked a question that caught him off guard. "Daddy, do you think Mom's case would be solved if she disappeared today instead of 2 years ago?" The question revealed how much his 11-year-old daughter had absorbed about forensic science from television shows she'd begun watching obsessively. Mark considered his answer carefully. "Technology keeps improving," he said finally. "Things they couldn't test for then, they might be able to now." "Why do you ask?" Lily shrugged, clutching the stuffed rabbit that had been her mother's last birthday gift to her. "I was thinking about other mommies who go missing. I hope they all get found too." The comment lingered with Mark long after Lily fell asleep. In focusing on his family's healing, he had given little thought to other victims, other families trapped in the particular hell of uncertainty he had experienced. The realization that technological advances might help solve cases that remained open stirred something in him, not quite purpose, but a direction his thoughts increasingly turned toward. As 2007 gave way to 2008, Mark began researching advances in forensic technology. He read articles about improved DNA testing, facial recognition software, and digital evidence recovery. Each breakthrough seemed to offer hope for cold cases that might otherwise remain unsolved. When he mentioned this growing interest to Detective Harrison, the older man nodded thoughtfully. "The field changes every year," Harrison confirmed. "Cases we couldn't crack 5 years ago might be solvable now with the right evidence. The problem is resources. Police departments have limited budgets for reopening old files when new cases keep coming in." This conversation planted a seed that would grow into something neither man could have anticipated. Mark Wheeler, once an unassuming accountant whose life had been defined by routine and stability, began to envision a different kind of contribution to the world, one born from his own tragedy. In March 2008, Mark approached Susan's parents with an unexpected proposal. He wanted to use a portion of Susan's life insurance payout, which had sat largely untouched in an account, to establish a foundation. Not just another memorial scholarship, but an organization dedicated to helping law enforcement agencies revisit cold cases with new technology. Susan would want her death to mean something, he explained as they sat in his in-laws' living room. "If we can help other families find answers, maybe some good can come from what happened to her." The Wheeler Foundation for Cold Case Resolution launched in summer 2008 with modest ambitions: fund DNA testing for one unsolved case in Hamilton County as a pilot project. Mark enlisted Detective Harrison as an advisor, leveraging his connections within the department to identify a suitable candidate: the 1998 disappearance of a college student whose case had gone cold despite physical evidence being preserved. Modern testing methods applied to decade-old DNA samples yielded results within months. The breakthrough led to the arrest of a man already imprisoned for similar crimes in Kentucky, finally providing answers to another family trapped in the limbo of not knowing. The success generated local media attention, bringing in donations that allowed the foundation to expand its efforts. By 2010, 5 years after Susan's murder, the Wheeler Foundation had helped solve 3 cold cases in Ohio and was expanding to neighboring states. Mark had reduced his accounting hours to part-time, dedicating more of his energy to the foundation's growth. The work wasn't easy. It meant immersing himself in others' tragedies, reopening his own wounds when cases echoed Susan's story, but it provided something his grief had previously lacked: direction. Jason, now 19 and starting college locally, worked at the foundation during summers, showing unexpected aptitude for the technological aspects of the work. Lily, at 16, channeled her ongoing interest in forensic science into research projects that sometimes yielded useful perspectives. What had begun as Mark's solitary mission gradually became a family endeavor, a way of honoring Susan that went beyond passive remembrance. The foundation's growing reputation led to an unexpected phone call in December 2010 from Detective Morgan Rivera of the Cincinnati Police Department's newly established cold case unit. Rivera had a case that had haunted the department for decades: the 1989 disappearance of 18-year-old Teresa Cardenas from the parking lot of a downtown shopping center. Like Susan's case, Teresa had vanished while running errands, her car later found abandoned miles away. Unlike Susan, Teresa had never been found. "We've preserved evidence from the original investigation," Rivera explained during her visit to the foundation's modest office. Hair fibers from her car, partial fingerprints, even a bloodstain from the trunk that was too small to test with 1989 technology. "With your foundation's resources, we might finally be able to tell her parents what happened to their daughter." Mark agreed immediately, recognizing in Teresa's case echoes of questions that had tormented him during Susan's disappearance. The foundation funded extensive testing, including advanced DNA analysis that hadn't existed even when Susan's case was solved. The results linked the evidence to a man named Edward Pritchard who had died in prison in 2001 while serving time for unrelated assaults. When Rivera delivered this news to Teresa's elderly parents, Mark accompanied her. He watched as 65-year-old Luisa Cardenas received the answer she had waited 21 years to hear. Though the resolution was bittersweet, no body had been found, no trial would bring formal justice, the certainty itself provided relief that Mark recognized intimately. "Now I can stop looking for her in crowds," Luisa said afterward, her weathered hands clutching a faded photo of her daughter. "I can stop wondering if she's out there somewhere, hurt or afraid. I can finally say goodbye." This moment crystallized for Mark the value of what the foundation was doing. Not just solving crimes or catching perpetrators, but providing families with the answers they needed to progress through grief. Justice mattered, but knowledge, the simple, terrible truth of what had happened, was often the key that unlocked frozen grief. As 2011 began, the Wheeler Foundation expanded its mission. Beyond funding forensic testing, they began advocating for better evidence preservation protocols in police departments across Ohio. Mark, once uncomfortable with public speaking, found himself addressing law enforcement conferences about the importance of maintaining evidence even when cases seemed hopeless. "Technology we can't even imagine today will exist tomorrow," he told a roomful of detectives at a regional training seminar. "Evidence you preserve now might yield answers years from now. Every unsolved case is someone's ongoing nightmare. Every piece of evidence you save might eventually bring them peace." The foundation's work attracted attention from national media. A feature in Time magazine highlighted the Wheeler family's journey from victims to advocates, including an interview with Jason, now studying criminal justice with plans to join law enforcement. The article described the Wheeler Foundation as born from tragedy, dedicated to transforming the landscape of cold case investigation in America. For Mark, this recognition brought mixed emotions. Pride in what they had accomplished existed alongside the persistent grief that never truly faded. Success couldn't fill the space Susan once occupied. On difficult nights, he still found himself reaching for her side of the bed, momentarily forgetting the years that had passed. Yet the foundation provided context for their loss, not meaning, exactly, but purpose. Detective Harrison, who had postponed retirement twice to continue working with the foundation, understood this duality better than most. "We're not trying to make sense of Susan's death," he told Mark during a late night at the office, reviewing applications from police departments seeking assistance. "Nothing can do that. We're just trying to build something good in a world where terrible things happen randomly. That's all any of us can do." In June 2012, 7 years after Susan's murder, the Wheeler Foundation faced its most significant challenge yet. Budget cuts had forced many police departments to reduce or eliminate cold case units, threatening to relegate thousands of unsolved cases to permanent obscurity. Mark organized a coalition of victims' families, law enforcement officers, and forensic experts to lobby state legislators for dedicated funding. Their testimony before the Ohio State Legislature included Mark sharing Susan's story, alongside families still waiting for answers. The emotional impact was powerful, particularly when Lily, now a poised young woman of 18, spoke about growing up in the shadow of her mother's murder and the healing that came from helping other families find resolution. "My mother's killer was caught because of dedicated detective work and advances in forensic science," she told the Silent Chamber. "Every victim deserves that same chance at justice, no matter how many years have passed. Every family deserves answers." The resulting legislation, informally known as the Susan Wheeler Act, established funding for cold case investigations across Ohio, with provisions for evidence preservation and regular review of unsolved cases using current technology. Similar bills were subsequently introduced in neighboring states, creating a ripple effect that extended the foundation's impact far beyond what Mark had initially envisioned. As the anniversary of Susan's disappearance approached in October 2012, Mark reflected on the journey of the past 7 years. The acute pain had gradually transformed into something more manageable, a persistent ache rather than a debilitating wound. He still missed Susan daily, still wondered about the life they might have shared, but had found a way to carry that loss while continuing forward. The Wheeler home had changed with the passing years. Jason had his own apartment near the university but returned frequently, especially for Sunday family dinners. Lily, preparing for college the following year, had redecorated her room but kept the photo of Susan on her nightstand. Mark had finally repainted the living room, a task Susan had been planning before her death, choosing colors she would have approved. On October 3rd, the family gathered at Susan's grave as they did each year, bringing yellow daisies and sharing memories. The ritual remained important, but no longer carried the overwhelming weight of earlier anniversaries. They could laugh at funny stories now, recalling Susan's terrible singing voice or her habit of rearranging furniture in the middle of the night when inspiration struck. That evening, as they sat around the dining table eating Susan's favorite meal, Mark raised his glass in a toast. "To your mom," he said, "who taught us that love continues even when the person is gone. And to what we've built in her name, helping other families find their way through the dark." Jason and Lily joined the toast, their glasses clinking in the warm light. In that moment, Mark felt something he hadn't expected to find again after Susan's death, not happiness exactly, but a profound sense of rightness, of living a life that honored her memory through action rather than only remembrance. Later, as Mark stood on the porch watching the autumn leaves drift from the maple tree, Detective Harrison's words from years earlier returned to him: "Justice moves slower than grief, but it does move." The Wheeler Foundation had helped make that movement possible for families who might otherwise have waited decades without answers. It couldn't erase what happened to Susan, couldn't fill the space she had left, but it created meaning from meaningless violence, a legacy that would continue long after the pain of her loss had faded from public memory. As night fell over Cincinnati, Mark Wheeler looked up at stars Susan had once pointed out to their children. Somewhere in that vast pattern of light and darkness, he felt her presence, not as a ghost or spirit, but as the enduring influence of a life well lived and well loved, continuing to shape the world even after its too early end. In January 2013, a phone call disrupted the steady rhythm the Wheeler Foundation had established. Detective Rivera's voice carried an urgency that immediately put Mark on alert. "We've got something you need to see," she said. "It's about the Cardenas case." Though Teresa Cardenas's case had been technically solved through DNA evidence linking Edward Pritchard to her disappearance, her body had never been found, leaving her family in a painful limbo between closure and continued uncertainty. When Mark arrived at the police station, Rivera led him to a small conference room where satellite images covered the table. "Last month, we interviewed Pritchard's former cellmate who recently finished his own sentence," Rivera explained. "He claimed Pritchard once bragged about burying Teresa in an abandoned quarry outside the city. We didn't have the resources to search the entire area, so we used the Foundation's satellite imaging grant to narrow it down. The aerial photos revealed subtle ground disturbances that forensic geologists identified as potential burial sites. Within a week, a search team located Teresa's remains exactly where the technology had indicated. After 24 years, she could finally come home." When Mark accompanied Detective Rivera to deliver the news to the Cardenas family, he witnessed a moment that resonated with his own experience, grief and relief colliding as a burden of uncertainty lifted. Luisa Cardenas clutched her husband's hand, tears streaming down her face. "I told her we'd find her," she whispered. "Every night for 24 years, I promised her that." This breakthrough catalyzed a significant expansion in the Wheeler Foundation's approach. Mark realized that technological solutions could be applied not just to testing existing evidence but to locating victims who remained missing decades after their disappearances. Throughout 2013, the foundation established partnerships with universities developing ground-penetrating radar, advanced satellite imaging, and underwater sonar equipment specifically calibrated for locating human remains. By the end of the year, these technologies had helped recover 3 missing persons across Ohio, providing answers to families who had waited between 11 and 32 years. The emotional impact of these discoveries reverberated through the Foundation's small office. Each success validated their mission, but also reopened wounds for Mark, Jason, and Lily, who saw reflections of their own loss in each case. In April 2014, the Wheeler Foundation reached a critical juncture. Their growing success had attracted attention from larger organizations interested in partnering or even acquiring their operations. A prominent national victims' rights group offered substantial funding that would allow them to expand beyond Ohio's borders, potentially helping hundreds more families. The proposal sparked intense debate within the foundation. Some board members saw it as a natural evolution of their work, a chance to magnify their impact. Others, including Detective Harrison, worried about losing their personal connection to each case, the human element that had defined their approach from the beginning. Mark retreated to Susan's memorial garden behind their home, a space that had evolved over the years into a peaceful sanctuary where he still felt closest to her. The maple tree that had once shaded their children's playtime now cast dappled light across perennial flowers chosen for their connection to Susan, yellow daisies, purple coneflowers, and the late-blooming asters she had loved. As he sat on the weathered bench, Lily joined him, now a poised 20-year-old studying forensic science at the University of Cincinnati. She had grown to resemble Susan so strongly that sometimes it caught Mark's breath, the same determined set to her jaw, the same thoughtful pause before speaking. "What would Mom think we should do?" she asked, plucking a fallen maple leaf from the ground. Mark considered the question carefully. "Your mother was practical but passionate. She believed in making a difference where you could, in the ways you could. But she also valued personal connection, knowing the names and faces of people she helped." Lily nodded slowly. "That's what I thought too. We could help more people with national funding, but would we know them the way we know the Cardenas family? The Mitchells? The Gonzalezes?" This conversation shaped the decision that followed. Rather than accepting the acquisition offer, the Wheeler Foundation charted a different course, establishing a training program to help other communities create their own local cold case initiatives. By sharing their methods, technology, and expertise rather than centralizing operations, they could maintain the personal connection to each case while still expanding their reach. Throughout late 2014 and early 2015, Mark traveled across the Midwest, speaking at law enforcement conferences and meeting with victims' advocacy groups. He shared not only the Foundation's technical approaches but the philosophy that drove their work, that every unsolved case represented a family stuck in perpetual grief, and that answers, even painful ones, offered a path toward healing. During this period of expansion, an unexpected development brought the Wheeler family's journey full circle. Victor Mercer, serving his 25th year in prison for Susan's murder, became eligible for his first parole hearing in May 2015. Though the likelihood of release was minimal given the nature of his crime, the mere possibility reopened wounds the family had worked years to heal. The parole hearing notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, a sterile government form that reduced Susan's life and death to case numbers and legal terminology. Mark found Jason sitting on the porch steps that evening, staring at nothing, the notification letter crumpled in his fist. "I don't want to see him," Jason said as his father settled beside him. Now 24, he had completed his criminal justice degree and was working as an evidence technician with the Cincinnati Police Department. "I don't want to hear him say he's sorry or that he's changed or whatever rehearsed speech he's prepared." Mark placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "You don't have to go. None of us do." "But someone should," Jason replied, his voice hardening. Someone should be there to speak for Mom. To remind them who she was, not just a case number. The decision of who would attend evolved through painful family discussions. Ultimately, it was Lily who insisted on representing the family. At 22, she possessed a composure that surprised even those who knew her well. "I was too young to testify at the original trial," she said during a Sunday dinner discussion. "I need to do this, not just for Mom, but for myself." On the morning of the hearing, Mark and Jason waited at home while Lily, accompanied by Detective Harrison, entered the institutional gray building where Mercer's fate would be discussed. She carried a small photo album containing images of Susan, as a young woman, as a mother, as the person whose absence had shaped their family for a decade. When called to speak, Lily approached the microphone with the quiet dignity that had become her hallmark. She opened the album and began not with anger or recrimination, but with stories: Susan helping a struggling student complete college applications, Susan organizing neighborhood cleanup days, Susan teaching Lily to braid hair the weekend before she died. Victor Mercer didn't just take a life, she concluded, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. He took a future. "My mother would be 58 today. She would have seen her children graduate college. She might have become a grandmother. She would have continued making our community better in countless small ways that add up to something immeasurable. The hole her absence left can never be filled, no matter how many years pass." The parole board's decision was unanimous and swift: release denied, with no reconsideration for 5 years. As Lily emerged from the hearing, Harrison's arm supportively around her shoulders, she appeared both drained and horrified. "He looked so ordinary," she told Mark and Jason later that evening. "Not a monster, just a man who made terrible choices." That's almost harder to accept. This confrontation with Mercer, seeing the human being behind the crime that had defined their family's trajectory, prompted Mark to expand the Foundation's work in an unexpected direction. Throughout 2015, they began developing educational programs aimed at preventing violence rather than just solving its aftermath. The initiative focused on teaching emotional regulation, conflict resolution, and respect for boundaries in middle and high schools throughout Cincinnati. If someone had reached Mercer before his resentment festered into obsession, Mark explained to the Foundation board, Susan might still be here. We can't change our story, but we might change someone else's. This preventative approach coincided with a significant shift in cold case methodology nationwide. In late 2015, genetic genealogy, a technique combining DNA analysis with family tree research, emerged as a powerful tool for identifying suspects in decades-old cases. The Wheeler Foundation quickly incorporated this approach into their arsenal, funding training for detectives across Ohio. The first success came in February 2016, when genetic genealogy helped solve the 1977 murder of a 16-year-old girl in Toledo. The breakthrough made national headlines, bringing renewed attention to the Foundation's work. Applications for assistance flooded in from police departments nationwide, overwhelming their small team. Rather than turning cases away, Mark and Jason developed a triage system, prioritizing those with preserved DNA evidence that could benefit most immediately from the new technology. They also established partnerships with volunteer genealogists willing to donate time to building family trees from DNA matches. This collaborative approach allowed them to accept twice as many cases without sacrificing the personal connection that remains central to their mission. As 2016 progressed, the Wheeler Foundation achieved a milestone that both honored and transcended Susan's legacy. Their combined technologies and methodologies had now helped solve 50 cold cases across the Midwest. Each resolution represented a family moving from uncertainty to knowledge, from frozen grief to the possibility of healing. To mark this achievement, Cincinnati Mayor Eleanor Richards proclaimed October 3, the anniversary of Susan's disappearance, as Cold Case Awareness Day throughout the city. During the ceremony at City Hall, Mayor Richards presented Mark with a key to the city, acknowledging how personal tragedy had been transformed into public service. The Wheeler family reminds us that our darkest moments need not define us, the mayor said to the assembled crowd. They can instead become the foundation for something that brings light to others walking through similar darkness. The recognition brought national media attention, including a segment on a prominent news magazine show. The interviewer, sitting in the Wheeler Foundation's offices, asked Mark a question that struck at the heart of their journey. Do you ever wish you could go back to your life before Susan's murder, before the foundation, before all of this? Mark considered the question carefully before answering. Of course I wish Susan hadn't been taken from us. I wish my children had grown up with their mother, that we had grown old together as we planned. But wishing can't change what happened. The choice we faced wasn't between our old life and this one, it was between letting grief consume us or channeling it into something meaningful. Susan taught us to choose meaning, even when it's difficult. Especially when it's difficult. This philosophy guided the Wheeler Foundation as it entered its second decade of operation in 2017. What had begun as one family's response to tragedy had evolved into an organization that changed how law enforcement approached cold cases nationwide. Beyond their technological innovations and funding support, they had helped shift the cultural perception of these cases, from forgotten files gathering dust to ongoing investigations deserving of resources and attention. In April 2017, this shift became tangible when Congress passed the Cold Case Accountability Act, legislation that Mark had helped draft and advocate for during multiple trips to Washington. The act established federal grants for local police departments to create dedicated cold case units, formalized evidence retention standards, and created a national database for sharing information across jurisdictional boundaries. At the bill signing ceremony, Mark stood alongside families from across the country whose loved ones' cases had been solved through the Wheeler Foundation's assistance. As cameras flashed and officials made speeches, Mark found himself thinking not of the high-profile victory but of Susan, how she would have approached this moment with a mixture of pride and humility, more concerned with the work still to be done than the accolades being bestowed. This mindset drove the Foundation's next initiative, addressing the disparities in which cold cases received attention and resources. Analysis of their own case selection had revealed unconscious biases. Cases involving young, white, middle-class victims were more likely to receive media coverage and investigative priority than those from marginalized communities. Beginning in summer 2017, the Wheeler Foundation established a dedicated fund specifically for cases involving victims of color, immigrant communities, and other underserved populations. The first case under this initiative involved Martina Diaz, a 22-year-old daughter of Mexican immigrants who had disappeared from her Cincinnati neighborhood in 1994. Despite her family's desperate pleas for help, the investigation had been cursory at best, with police initially suggesting she had likely returned to Mexico voluntarily. When Mark met with the Diaz family, their grief remained as raw as if Martina had vanished yesterday rather than 23 years earlier. Her mother, Elena, had maintained a small altar in their home, adorned with Martina's photo and fresh flowers changed weekly for over 2 decades. Her father, Roberto, had walked the same route through their neighborhood every Sunday, asking strangers if they remembered his daughter. "No one listened to us then," Elena said quietly as she served coffee in their modest living room. "Why would they listen now?" Mark made a promise that day that the Wheeler Foundation would apply every resource at their disposal to Martina's case. Within 3 months, genetic genealogy testing of preserved evidence identified a suspect, a former building superintendent who had lived in their apartment complex and subsequently moved to Arizona. When confronted with the DNA evidence, he confessed to Martina's murder and led authorities to her remains in a remote area outside the city. The resolution of Martina Diaz's case illuminated systemic issues within cold case investigation that the Wheeler Foundation committed to addressing. Throughout late 2017 and 2018, they conducted training sessions for law enforcement focused on cultural competency, implicit bias, and equitable resource allocation. These efforts sometimes met resistance from traditional police departments but found champions among a new generation of detectives committed to justice for all victims. In October 2018, 13 years after Susan's murder, the Wheeler family gathered at her grave as they did each year. Jason, now 27 and recently engaged to a fellow forensic technician, placed yellow daisies beside the headstone. Lily, 25 and in her final year of law school, knelt to clear away fallen leaves. Mark stood between them, a hand on each of their shoulders, reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. The foundation they had built from grief now employed 15 people full-time, had helped solve over 70 cold cases nationwide, and had trained hundreds of law enforcement officers in advanced investigative techniques. Susan's legacy extended far beyond their family, touching lives they would never meet, bringing resolution to pain they could uniquely understand. Later that evening, as they shared dinner at the home on Maple Street, now filled with photographs not only of Susan but of the milestones she had missed, Lily raised her glass in what had become their annual tradition. "To Mom," she said, "who taught us that love continues beyond loss. And to the foundation that carries her spirit forward." As glasses clinked in the warm light, Mark felt the familiar mixture of pride and grief that had become the emotional signature of their lives. Susan's absence remained, a space that could never be filled, but alongside it had grown something powerful and enduring. In February 2019, the Wheeler Foundation's focus on technological innovation led to their most ambitious project yet. Partnering with artificial intelligence researchers at the University of Cincinnati, they began developing an algorithm to identify connections between seemingly unrelated cold cases. The system analyzed victim profiles, crime scene details, and geographical patterns to detect similarities that might indicate serial offenders operating across different jurisdictions and time frames. The project's first success came in July 2019, when the algorithm identified potential links between 5 disappearances spanning 3 states in 15 years. Though the victims varied in age and background, subtle commonalities in their cases suggested a single perpetrator. When investigators re-examined the evidence through this new lens, DNA connections confirmed the algorithm's hypothesis, leading to the identification of a long-haul truck driver who had traveled extensively throughout the Midwest between 1985 and 2000. This breakthrough demonstrated the value of applying cutting-edge technology to historical cases. The Wheeler Foundation received a substantial federal grant to expand the AI program, allowing them to analyze thousands of unsolved cases nationally. By late 2019, the system had identified potential connections in dozens of cases, giving detectives new avenues to explore in investigations that had long gone cold. As their technological reach expanded, Mark remained committed to the human element of their work. He continued personally meeting with families of victims, understanding that the Foundation's true purpose wasn't solving puzzles but helping people navigate grief. These conversations often proved as valuable to the investigations as any DNA test or algorithm, revealing details that had been overlooked or forgotten during initial investigations. In December 2019, a meeting with the family of Richard Cunningham, missing since 1997, yielded a crucial insight. Richard's brother mentioned a seemingly insignificant detail, that Richard had been wearing a distinctive watch given to him by their grandfather, its serial number recorded for insurance purposes. This information, absent from police reports, allowed investigators to identify remains found in Indiana 2 years after his disappearance but never connected to his case. The Cunningham family's Christmas included a proper memorial service for Richard, 22 years after he vanished. As Mark sat in the back of the church watching them find a measure of peace, he reflected on how the Foundation's work had evolved. What had begun as a search for justice had transformed into something more fundamental, a mission to restore the dignity of remembrance to those who had been forgotten. This philosophy guided the Wheeler Foundation as it entered a new decade in January 2020. Planning began for their 15th anniversary, including a comprehensive report on advances in cold case methodology and a memorial exhibition honoring victims whose cases had been resolved through their work. Then, in March 2020, the world changed. The COVID-19 pandemic forced the Foundation to adapt quickly as lockdowns restricted in-person investigations and laboratory work slowed dramatically. Rather than pausing their mission, Mark and his team pivoted to what could be accomplished remotely, digitizing case files, refining their AI algorithm, and conducting virtual training for law enforcement agencies nationwide. This period of forced adaptation yielded unexpected benefits. The Foundation's digital presence expanded significantly, creating online communities for families of missing persons who previously had limited access to support. Their webinars reached police departments in rural areas that could never have afforded to send officers to in-person training. The necessity of working within constraints sparked innovation that would continue long after restrictions lifted. By September 2020, as the world cautiously reopened, the Wheeler Foundation emerged stronger and more accessible than before. Their 15-year anniversary celebration, conducted as a hybrid in-person and virtual event, drew participants from across the country. Families whose cases had been solved shared their stories alongside detectives who had worked with the foundation, creating a powerful testament to what had been accomplished since Susan's death. During the event, Mark announced their most ambitious initiative yet, the Susan Wheeler National Cold Case Center, a physical facility that would combine cutting-edge laboratory services, training facilities, and support resources for families. The center would serve as both a practical resource for law enforcement and a symbolic statement about the value of pursuing justice regardless of how much time had passed. Groundbreaking for the center took place in April 2021, on land donated by the University of Cincinnati adjacent to their forensic science department. The modern glass and steel building was designed to embody the foundation's philosophy, transparent, forward-looking, but grounded in human experience. Construction would be funded through a combination of federal grants, private donations, and a significant contribution from the Wheeler family from the remainder of Susan's life insurance policy. As bulldozers broke ground, Mark stood with Jason and Lily, now accomplished adults whose lives had been shaped but not defined by their mother's absence. Jason had recently been promoted to supervisor in the Cincinnati Police Department's forensic unit and was expecting his first child with his wife. Lily had completed law school and joined the prosecutor's office, specializing in cold cases. "Mom would be so proud of you both," Mark said as they watched the ceremonial first shovel of dirt turn. "Not just for what you've accomplished, but for who you've become." "She'd be proud of you too, Dad," Lily replied, squeezing his hand. "You could have let anger consume you. Instead, you built something that matters." In October 2021, as the center neared completion, Mark received news that brought their 16-year journey to an unexpected crossroads. Victor Mercer, now in his late 50s and suffering from advanced cancer, had requested a compassionate release from prison. His petition included a handwritten letter addressed directly to the Wheeler family, the first communication they had received from Susan's killer since his confession. The letter arrived on a crisp autumn morning, delivered by Detective Harrison, now retired but still deeply connected to the Wheeler family. Mark sat at the kitchen table, the familiar envelope bearing the prison stamp lying untouched before him. "You don't have to read it," Harrison said gently. "No one would blame you if you threw it away." Mark shook his head slowly. "Whatever he has to say, I need to hear it." "We all do." The decision to share Mercer's letter with Jason and Lily wasn't made lightly. Both had built lives that honored their mother's memory while moving beyond the tragedy of her death. Opening this communication risked disrupting the healing they had worked so hard to achieve. Yet Mark believed they deserved the choice to read or ignore Mercer's words. That Sunday, the family gathered in the living room that had witnessed so many difficult conversations over the years. The maple tree outside the window had grown massive, its leaves beginning to turn the rich gold that had always reminded them of Susan's favorite season. Mark unfolded the letter, written in a shaky hand that betrayed Mercer's declining health. The words that followed were neither excuse nor justification but an acknowledgement of the irreparable harm he had caused, not just in taking Susan's life but in the years of pain that followed for her family. "I know there can be no forgiveness," Mercer had written in conclusion. "I don't ask for that. I only want you to know that I understand now what I took from you, and that knowledge is a punishment greater than any prison sentence." The silence that followed Mark's reading stretched long and heavy. Finally, Jason spoke, his voice tight with emotion. "Does his understanding change anything for us?" "No," Mark replied honestly. "It doesn't bring your mother back. It doesn't erase what happened. But it confirms what we've built, and her name matters, that acknowledging the full humanity of victims changes even those responsible for their loss." The decision regarding Mercer's compassionate release request was one the family wrestled with deeply. After days of discussion and soul-searching, they chose not to oppose it, not out of forgiveness, but from recognition that his remaining time, whether spent in prison or hospice care, changed nothing about their own journey forward. Victor Mercer died in November, 2 weeks after his release to a medical facility, having served 16 years of his sentence. The Wheeler family chose not to attend his funeral, instead spending the day at the nearly completed Cold Case Center, walking through spaces that would soon help bring resolution to other families trapped in uncertainty. On April 15, 2022, the Susan Wheeler National Cold Case Center officially opened its doors. The dedication ceremony brought together law enforcement officials, victims' advocates, forensic experts, and dozens of families whose cases had been solved through the Wheeler Foundation's work. The building's central atrium featured a wall of photographs, not of victims as they had appeared in missing persons reports, but as they had lived, celebrating birthdays, graduating, laughing with friends, being fully human rather than merely tragic figures. As Mark cut the ribbon across the entrance, flanked by Jason and Lily, he felt the weight of the journey that had brought them here. 17 years had passed since Susan's murder, longer than Lily had known her mother, nearly 2/3 of Jason's life. The pain of her absence never truly vanished, but it had transformed into something constructive, even beautiful in its way. Later that evening, as the family stood in the center's peaceful memorial garden modeled after the one behind their home, Jason's infant daughter sleeping against his shoulder, Mark reflected on Susan's legacy. She lived on not only in her children and grandchild but in every family who found answers through the Foundation's work, in every cold case detective who approached old files with new determination, in every technological advancement that made impossible cases solvable. "We didn't just survive," Mark said softly to his children as twilight settled around them. "We built something that matters, something that helps others survive their own darkest days. That's a legacy your mother would be proud of." As they walked together toward the exit, passing beneath the center's mission statement etched in glass, "Because every unsolved case is someone's ongoing nightmare," Mark felt a sense of completion. The circle that began with one family's tragedy had expanded to encompass countless others, offering not just justice but the possibility of healing in its wake. The Wheeler family's journey from victims to advocates, from grief-stricken survivors to architects of change, stood as testament to the resilience of the human spirit. In transforming their personal pain into public purpose, they had created meaning from senseless violence, not erasing the tragedy, but ensuring it wasn't the end of the story. In January 2023, the Susan Wheeler National Cold Case Center faced its most challenging year yet. Budget constraints following the pandemic threatened programs across the criminal justice system, including the federal grants that supported much of the center's work. Police departments nationwide scaled back cold case units, redirecting resources to address rising crime rates in the present rather than solving mysteries of the past. Mark Wheeler, now in his early 60s with silver threading through his dark hair, found himself once again fighting for the importance of cold case investigation, this time not against public apathy but against economic reality. The battle took him to Washington, where he testified before a congressional committee considering cuts to the Cold Case Accountability Act funding. Fiscal responsibility matters, Mark acknowledged, standing before lawmakers in the wood-paneled hearing room. But so does our responsibility to victims and their families. Every unsolved case represents not just a failure of justice but an ongoing wound in our communities. When we abandon these cases, we send a message that some lives matter less than others, that some grief can be ignored if it becomes inconvenient. His testimony, alongside that of families still waiting for answers, succeeded in preserving core funding. However, the center would need to operate with significantly reduced resources for the foreseeable future. This reality forced difficult decisions about which cases to prioritize and which innovative programs might need to be suspended. During this period of uncertainty, an unexpected opportunity emerged. Dr. Eliza Chen, a pioneering researcher in forensic archaeology, approached the Wheeler Foundation with a proposal to establish a cold case field school that would train graduate students while advancing actual investigations. The program would allow the center to continue its work with minimal cost by incorporating student volunteers under professional supervision. "Think of it as a teaching hospital model for cold case investigation," Dr. Chen explained during her presentation to the Foundation's board. Students gain invaluable experience while providing the manpower we desperately need for labor-intensive aspects of these cases. Everyone benefits: the students, the investigations, and ultimately the families waiting for answers. Mark immediately recognized the potential, not just as a stopgap during funding challenges but as a transformative approach to cold case work. By May 2023, the field school welcomed its first cohort of 12 graduate students from forensic science, archaeology, and criminal justice programs nationwide. Their inaugural project focused on a series of disappearances along the Ohio-Kentucky border between 1975 and 1982, cases long considered unrelated but flagged by the center's AI algorithm as potentially connected. The students brought fresh perspectives and boundless energy to investigations that had languished for decades. They digitized fragile paper records, created comprehensive timelines incorporating social and historical context from the period, and applied modern analytical techniques to evidence preserved but never fully examined with contemporary technology. In July 2023, their efforts yielded the first breakthrough, identifying a distinctive soil composition in evidence samples that narrowed the search area to a specific geological formation spanning just 20 square miles. This discovery led to the recovery of remains from 3 victims, missing for over 40 years, whose cases had been relegated to occasional review by overwhelmed detectives. The success of the field school attracted attention from both academic institutions and law enforcement agencies. Applications for the fall semester doubled, allowing the center to expand the program and take on additional cases. Universities began offering course credit for participation, further legitimizing the approach and ensuring a steady stream of qualified students eager to contribute. For Mark, watching these young people apply their skills to cases older than they were provided a profound sense of continuity. The work would continue even when he and those who had built the foundation were no longer leading it. The mission had transcended its origins and personal grief to become an enduring institution. In September 2023, a development in the center's technological capabilities opened new possibilities for cold case resolution. The AI system they had developed to identify connections between cases evolved to incorporate visual analysis of crime scene photographs, identifying subtle commonalities invisible to the human eye. This advancement allowed for the re-examination of thousands of cases previously considered isolated incidents. The system's analysis of photographic evidence from 28 unsolved homicides across 5 states revealed a pattern of distinctive ligature markings that suggested a single perpetrator. When researchers applied modern DNA extraction techniques to preserved evidence from these cases, they confirmed a genetic link in 17 of them. The discovery of this previously unidentified serial predator, active from 1968 to 1987, represented one of the most significant breakthroughs in American cold case history. While the perpetrator had died in 1992, the identification still brought a measure of peace to families who had spent decades wondering what had happened to their loved ones. Mark attended a memorial service where relatives from across the country gathered, many meeting for the first time, united by a shared tragedy now finally understood. Eleanor Sanderson, whose sister had vanished in 1973, approached Mark after the service. "For 50 years, I've imagined her alive somewhere, unable to come home for reasons I couldn't fathom," she said, tears tracking down her lined face. "Now I can finally mourn her properly. It's a strange thing to be grateful for terrible news, but the truth, however painful, is better than endless uncertainty." Her words crystallized something Mark had understood intuitively throughout the Foundation's existence but had never articulated so clearly. The work they did wasn't about catching killers or closing cases in an administrative sense. It was about allowing grief its natural progression, something impossible when questions remained unanswered. This insight informed a significant expansion of the center's mission in early 2024. Beyond the technological and investigative aspects that had defined their approach, they began developing comprehensive support services for families of cold case victims. The program included specialized counseling, peer support groups, and resources to help navigate the complex emotions that accompanied resolution after years or decades of uncertainty. In February 2024, the center hosted its first Living with Unresolved Loss conference, bringing together mental health professionals, victims' advocates, and families experiencing prolonged grief. The event addressed the unique challenges faced by those whose loved ones disappeared or whose murders remained unsolved, the ambiguous loss that prevented closure, the cycles of hope and disappointment with each potential breakthrough, the guilt survivors often felt about continuing their own lives. Lily Wheeler, now a respected prosecutor specializing in cold cases, delivered the keynote address. She spoke not as an expert but as someone who had lived the experience, sharing how her childhood had been shaped by her mother's murder and the years of uncertainty that followed. "There's no guidebook for growing up in the shadow of an unsolved crime," she told the hushed audience. "No instruction manual for celebrating graduations or weddings while carrying the weight of an empty chair. We created our own path forward, sometimes stumbling, sometimes barely moving, but always with the determination that my mother's absence would not be the only legacy of her life." The conference established a national network of support for families navigating similar journeys. Regular online sessions connected people across geographical boundaries, while regional in-person meetings fostered communities of understanding that many participants had never found elsewhere. For Mark, watching these connections form represented a different kind of healing, not the resolution of cases, but the alleviation of the isolation that often accompanied them. In May 2024, as the center approached its third anniversary, an unexpected communication arrived from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. Their analysts had been studying the Wheeler Foundation's AI system and its success in identifying connections between seemingly unrelated cases. They proposed an unprecedented partnership that would integrate the center's technology with federal databases, potentially revolutionizing how cold cases were approached nationally. The proposal represented everything Mark had hoped the foundation would accomplish, systemic change that extended far beyond what one organization could achieve independently. After weeks of negotiation regarding privacy safeguards and operational protocols, the partnership was formalized in June 2024. The Susan Wheeler National Cold Case Center would serve as a civilian auxiliary to federal cold case initiatives, providing technological expertise while maintaining its independence. This elevation of the center's role coincided with a personal milestone for the Wheeler family. Jason and his wife welcomed their second child, a daughter they named Susan, continuing the family's tradition of honoring the past while embracing the future. The baby's arrival during this period of institutional growth felt symbolically significant, a reminder that life's continuity persisted alongside loss. During the informal family gathering to celebrate the birth, Mark found himself on the back porch of Jason's suburban home, cradling his newborn granddaughter while watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold. Detective Harrison, now in his late 70s but still sharp-minded, joined him with careful steps that betrayed his aging body. 19 years, Harrison said quietly, nodding toward the horizon. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday, other times like another lifetime entirely." Mark nodded, feeling the baby's steady heartbeat against his chest. "I still think about who she'd be now. What she'd think of all this, the foundation, the center, these grandchildren she never got to meet." Harrison's weathered hand rested briefly on Mark's shoulder. "She'd recognize herself in all of it. The determination to help others, the refusal to accept that some things can't be fixed. That was Susan to her core." The conversation fell into comfortable silence as they watched the light change, each man carrying his own version of the past alongside appreciation for the present moment. When Lily joined them, her prosecutorial confidence temporarily softened by the presence of her new niece, the circle felt both complete and incomplete, family bound not just by blood but by a shared journey through darkness toward purpose. In August 2024, the center's partnership with the FBI yielded its first major breakthrough. The integrated database identified a pattern linking 34 disappearances of young men along interstate highways between 1991 and 2013. The victims, primarily hitchhikers or transient workers, had fallen through jurisdictional cracks, their cases rarely connected due to geographical dispersion and the marginalized status of many victims. The investigation that followed exemplified the center's comprehensive approach. Field school students mapped the disappearances against truck routes and rest stop locations. The AI system analyzed available evidence for commonalities. Genealogical DNA testing of preserved samples built family trees that eventually converged on a long-haul trucker who had died in 2017. When investigators searched property the suspect had owned in rural Pennsylvania, they discovered evidence confirming their worst fears: personal effects from multiple victims buried across the expansive woodland. The recovery operation became the largest in the center's history, involving dozens of forensic anthropology students, FBI evidence response teams, and local law enforcement across 2 months of meticulous excavation. By October 2024, 19 victims had been identified through DNA comparison with families who had spent. The possibility of meeting. After several family discussions, they agreed to a carefully structured conversation facilitated by a trauma-informed mediator at the center. The meeting took place on a snowy February morning. Catherine arrived alone, her resemblance to her father momentarily startling to the Wheelers despite their preparation. The initial minutes passed in awkward politeness until Catherine spoke directly to the purpose of her visit. "I've spent 20 years trying to understand how the father who taught me to ride a bike could commit such a horrible act," she said, hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I've come to accept there are no satisfying answers. But watching what you've built in Susan's name helped me see that understanding isn't always necessary for healing. Sometimes purpose is enough." She explained that she had recently completed training as a victim advocate and hoped to work specifically with families affected by violent crime. Her experience as a perpetrator's relative gave her insight into complexities rarely addressed in conventional support services: the complicated grief of loving someone who had caused immeasurable harm to others. The conversation that followed transcended the circumstances that brought them together. They spoke not as people divided by tragedy but as individuals who had each found ways to create meaning from experiences no one would choose. By the meeting's end, tentative connections had formed that none had anticipated: not friendship exactly, but mutual recognition of humanity persistent even in darkness. For Mark, this unexpected development embodied everything the foundation had come to represent: the possibility of transformation not through forgetting or forgiving, but through channeling pain toward purpose. Catherine's journey paralleled their own in its way, different in circumstance but similar in the fundamental choice to move forward with intention rather than remain defined by the past. The Foundation's 20th anniversary commemoration in April 2025 incorporated this expanded understanding of its mission. Beyond celebrating technological advances and cases resolved, the event highlighted the human dimensions of healing after trauma. Panel discussions included not only investigators and family members but also mental health professionals, community builders, and others working at various points along the spectrum of recovery. The centerpiece of the commemoration was the dedication of a new memorial garden on the center's grounds, designed to honor both victims of unsolved crimes and those who devoted their lives to seeking answers. Unlike traditional monuments focused on loss, this space celebrated resilience: flowering plants selected for their ability to thrive in difficult conditions, pathways that spiraled outward rather than circling endlessly, benches positioned to catch morning light symbolizing new beginnings. At the garden's heart stood a simple granite column bearing Susan Wheeler's name alongside words that had become the Foundation's unofficial motto: "Because every unsolved case is someone's ongoing nightmare." Surrounding this central element, smaller markers acknowledged others who had been instrumental in the center's development: Detective Harrison, now in failing health but present for the dedication; early volunteers who had distributed flyers when Susan first disappeared; forensic technicians who had preserved evidence that would prove crucial decades later. During the dedication ceremony, Mark stood between Jason and Lily, his silver hair catching the spring sunlight. Before them stretched not just the garden but the center itself, its glass walls reflecting the sky, its laboratories humming with activity even on this ceremonial day. Inside, students and professionals continued the work of transforming cold files into resolved cases, of converting questions into answers that might allow families to move forward. 20 years ago, Mark began, his voice steady despite the emotion of the moment: "We faced a choice between being consumed by grief or channeling it into something meaningful. We chose the harder path, not moving on from Susan's memory, but moving forward with it as our foundation." What began as one family's response to tragedy has become something larger than ourselves, a community dedicated to the belief that no case is ever truly cold as long as someone remembers. As he spoke, Mark's gaze found familiar faces in the crowd, families whose cases had been solved through the center's work, officers who had investigated Susan's disappearance 2 decades earlier, Catherine Mercer standing respectfully at the gathering's edge, his grandchildren too young to understand the full significance but absorbing the importance through the reverence around them. The true measure of what we've built isn't in technology or techniques, though those matter enormously, Mark continued. It's in the community that has formed around this work, people who refuse to accept that some questions must remain unanswered, who understand that closure isn't a single moment but a process of healing made possible by truth. After the formal ceremony concluded, Mark lingered in the garden as others moved toward the reception inside. The spring air carried the scent of newly planted flowers and freshly turned earth, renewal emerging from dormancy. He ran his fingers over Susan's name on the central column, the granite smooth and cool beneath his touch. 20 years had transformed not only the world around him but Mark himself. The devastated husband who had stood helpless in his living room as police searched for his missing wife had become someone unimaginable to that earlier self, founder of a national institution, catalyst for policy change, voice for those still waiting for answers. The grief remained, a companion rather than an enemy, no longer all-consuming but permanently entwined with his identity. As Mark turned to join his family inside, he glimpsed Susan's photo on a wall visible through the center's glass facade, not the somber image from missing persons flyers but one taken on a family vacation, her smile radiant as she hugged their children on a sun-drenched beach. That joyful moment preserved in time existed alongside the tragedy that followed, neither diminishing the other, both essential to the complete story. The Wheeler Foundation had begun with a single question: what happened to Susan? In answering that question, they had created something that now helped others find their own answers, a legacy that would continue long after those who knew Susan personally were gone. The work remained unfinished, thousands of cases still awaited resolution, thousands of families still lived in the particular hell of not knowing, but each day brought the possibility of one more mystery solved, one more family beginning to heal. As Mark walked toward the building bearing his wife's name, he felt the familiar mixture of sorrow and purpose that had defined the past 2 decades. One case at a time, transforming grief into action, absence into presence, tragedy into meaning that transcended its origins. In this transformation lay not just personal healing but a model for moving through the darkest human experiences towards something resembling light. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.